Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, this is BestInSlot, and welcome back to Cryptid Park, a semi-educational Jurassic World Evolution park building series, where we're going to build a Jurassic Park tour that sees several dinosaurs, but all of them inspired by real-life cryptids, either in actual physical form or just in the emotions they evoke. Now, one of the things I want to talk about very quickly is this path right here. As people rightly pointed out, this is the road for the Beast of Bray Road, the Indoraptor we added last time. There is actually a concrete track in the game, so we should bring that in at some point and replace this with an actual road. That would make a lot of sense. We'll definitely get on that. If not today, then in the future. And speaking of the Indoraptor, it should be this road, right? I kind of put the stone there, but I can't directly replace it. I have to go and I have to delete the road and then bring it back. It's kind of a pain, but we'll definitely do that down the line. There's our Indoraptor Wilkołak. I assume it's a Vil, not a Will. I don't know. But it's Polish. It's the Polish name for werewolf. I thought that was pretty cool. Thank you for the suggestion. Unfortunately, obviously, lots of your suggestions couldn't make it in. There's only one creature, but hopefully you understand. So, before we get started on today, I want to get the animal going right away because it is an Indominus Rex. It does take a little bit of time to get hatched, and then we'll do our little introduction. I wrote a lot for this one. I think it's the new record, so we're going to learn a lot about the Wendigo today. A lot of stuff that blew my mind a little bit. I learned a lot today, I really did. So, let's talk about it. Before we do get started, I want to give a huge amount of credit to a paper. Now, in the past, for these videos, I've read online articles by some pretty well-renowned National Geographic and stuff like that. I've taken links from Wikipedia, I've just Googled and had a little look. And it's always been good for, like, the basal information. The Wendigo one is a little different. There's this paper called Cannibalism in Contact Narratives and the Evolution of the Wendigo. And it's an amazing piece of work that not only examines the origins of the Wendigo, but how perceptions on cannibalism, particularly by European explorers, by us lot, would come to unjustly shape perceptions of indigenous people and indeed then drive the evolution of the Wendigo to its modern form. I'm going to link that paper down below. Most of the information we're going to be talking about today does come from that paper. It's really interesting and I really recommend everyone give it a big read. It is like 89 pages long and it will take a while, but if you're interested in the Wendigo and particularly in the Native American version, how it does tie in with the colonization of America by the, I don't want to say the West because we're kind of in the middle, but by, you know, the Europeans, then it's definitely worth giving a look. Now, we'll move on to the next stage in a little bit. Let's just build ourselves a fence. I've been thinking about this. It's getting humongous, right? Like, the whole thing is humongous. So we're gonna shrink in a little bit here. I'm gonna bring in our fence, and it's just gonna go from here instead. I'm gonna bring some stuff in around here at some point later on, I think is the idea. For now, we're only gonna have one creature, so I don't want it to be massive. I think we'll just curl around there. Now, as we'll talk about in a second, the Wendigo is often, well, it is entirely, essentially, originally, a part of the northern cultures, particularly the northeast in the US, around Wisconsin and areas like that, but also Canada. Basically, usually the frigid forests, essentially, which is a word I'll say in my script in a moment, I'm sure. The point is, it should be cold. Now, I was tempted to bring in a snow mod, but of course that would undo all the other exhibits we've done already, so it's a little bit difficult to do so. So we're going to have to just kind of use our imagination a little bit. I'm also going to redo the tour route right now, because I can't carry the tour route on without doing this one again. So, let's go into delete mode, and let's hope that we can, rebuild this as best as possible, basically. So we're just deleting that. And then we're going to swap over here to concrete tour track. It's a little bit annoying, but shouldn't be that big of a deal. Just got to finagle our way around all these various trees, because there's a lot of trees. Easy does it. There we go. Nope, not quite. Come on. It's not getting the doesn't quite have the straight line that I was looking for from last time, you know. Where we go about there. Hey, not bad, not bad. Not perfect, but not bad. I will blimmin' take it with bells on. Right, we need our JP gate. There we go. And then I think we're going to, given the origins of the Wendigo are really older, centuries old even, I think we're going to stick with the non-concrete for this. Now, like I said, it is a creature usually inhabiting frozen plains, and they would be plains that wouldn't necessarily be that much. Be quite a lot of forest as well. I think we want a nice mix of frozen and non-frozen. So what we're going to do is we're going to curl down here. We're going to go into the woods, and then we're going to curl back out into the open plains, like so. Something like that. And we can put one there, blah, blah, blah. Right, so, with all that said and done, let's talk a little bit about the Wendigo itself. Now, it is worth noting... Wait, let me get a nice dramatic view, because I'm not really doing anything other than talk. I've got a plan, by the way, for... I talked about it briefly on my Patreon, for everyone who's on there already, but I've got a little bit of a plan for how I can talk about cryptid content in the future. We'll talk about that later, or probably at the end of the video. What should we look at? Let's look at the JP gate. It's beautiful. Wait. Let me get a nice view. Okay, so, the Wendigo. So, it's worth noting that the Wendigo is not really a cryptid in the traditional sense. It's, you know, I see a cryptid as basically a undiscovered creature out there in the wilderness, right? A Wendigo instead is more deeply entrenched in mythology, tradition, and folklore. A lot of cryptids are... But we can safely say that the Wendigo is not out there in the wilderness, right? As an actual physical creature. Because it isn't. We know the origins, we know where it came from. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. It's deeply steeped in the traditions of the Algonquin people, who are an indigenous population who, as I say, typically inhabited the northeast of the US, very, very much the north, and obviously in Canada and Nova Scotia and areas like that. The Algonquins themselves are made up of several different groups, all of whom have their own tales of the Wendigo passed down from generation to generation. To the point where there's tons of different names for the Wendigo, often similar, like the Wendigo is one and the Windigo is one, there's tons of them. But that said, so pervasive is the mythology of the Wendigo, and so dominant is the new modern mainstream interpretation of the Wendigo that people do now see it in the wild. It's happened several times. If you Google it, you'll find examples of people in these areas spotting the Wendigo in the forests, in the frigid forests of the north, as I said I was going to say. To the point where I think we can give it cryptid status, even whilst acknowledging it probably, well, it isn't. You know what I mean? It's a really interesting creature, I want to talk about it. Now, before we dig deeper into the Wendigo throughout this video, there is an aspect of it I would like to cover. The Wendigo basically comes in two forms. The version envisioned by the indigenous Algonquins, and the version created by, if we're honest, the people who came and took their land. I'm going to speak about this more later on, but I think it's worth keeping in mind throughout this that the Wendigo was a well-known facet of Algonquin culture, and it was essentially bastardized by the people attempting to, inverted commas, colonize the Americas. By us, by Europeans. We did some bad things. This was a long time ago, and I definitely find enjoyment, I know a lot of people do, in that modern mainstream interpretation of the Wendigo. You know, the gaunt, half-animal beast creature with the horns. We'll talk about that again, but it's a really interesting story, and it makes for an interesting monster. And that is very much what I thought of the Wendigo as. I knew there's links to cannibalism and all this kind of jazz, and there definitely are, but that's how I always perceived the Wendigo. And it was a little ignorant on my part, because there's so much more to the creature than that, and whilst I think anyone can go and enjoy this new version, because it's a cool creature and that's all it has to be, I think if you're going to do that, I think it's important, or at least it's important to me going forward, to also be aware of the origins of the creature and what it actually means to the Algonquin people themselves. Yeah. So basically, throughout this video, I'm mainly going to be paying respect to that original version. I would like in the future to really dive... It's actually a fascinating history, honestly, the Wendigo and its relationship to colonialism and the taking over of America and all that kind of jazz. It's actually really interesting, and I'd like to talk about it more in the future, but we'll cover it a little bit today. Anyways, paragraph over, we can do some building. This is the plan going forward. So, we have our Indominus Rex. The Indominus Rex, by the way, is perfect for this. Absolutely perfect for the Wendigo, and you'll see why in a little bit. Let's pop it out. It is agonizingly good. It is by far the best creature you could imagine for the Wendigo. That scream is amazing. A scream will always be amazing. And there it is, our camo gene Indominus Rex. So, why is the Indominus Rex perfect? So, to get into that, we have to talk about what a Wendigo actually looks like. And like I said, we're going to mainly talk about the Algonquin version here. It's worth noting that, rather predictably, the origins of the Wendigo are hard to trace. This is going back centuries. The impression I got from my reading is that the Wendigo has basically existed since the Algonquin people existed. When they were first trying to explain the world around them is where the birth of the Wendigo comes from. It's an ancient being, to say the least. Basically, from their perspective, as the land was first birthed, people were created upon it, and then these people were taught how to live by things called Manitus. Manitou? I think it's Manitous. I think it's Manitous, but I'm apprehensive about ruining that, but I think it's Manitous. We're going to call them Manitous. I thought it was Manitous, but I did check it on Google, and it said Manitous, so we're going Manitous. Anyways, these are essentially spirits, life spirits, and they're both good and evil, and they came to teach the Algonquins how to live their lives. And the most evil of all of these spirits was the Wendigo, a spirit that embodied the worst facets of humanity in both manner and form. It was a bestial embodiment of winter itself, essentially. Go on, Winter. Let's go, buddy. Remember, you can name the Indominus Rex if you check out the comment section description down below. I should say there's a link to a cutie hybrid Indominus Rex on the cutie. Let me know what you think our Wendigo should be called. In terms of decorating the enclosure, I don't have any big ideas at all. Like, if we had some snow, it would be better. What I'm thinking is it should be like a plain and a forest. I want both. I really want both. I'm wondering, although I'm not convinced it'll work, if I can... I also want some water, I've decided. Maybe like a little river. That'd be cool. I'm wondering if I can... That's pretty cool. If I can use sand to look like snow, I don't know if that's optimistic, but if it's maybe like just like very lightly done. I mean, if at the very least we just do this and we kind of like lighten the ground, gives it a very different... I don't want it to look like just grass, you know? I want it to look a little bit different, so... Maybe just lighten the ground. That doesn't look like sand to me, but it looks like light, plain grass, I guess. Slash mountainy kind of way. I want to bring in some rock as well to give the idea that this is... I said a plain, but it's also a mountain. I really want to have that feeling of, you know, the rugged mountains and the cold and the chill. And we can't really get that, but we can really do something like that. Let's talk more about the Wendigo. Second half of that paragraph. So it's winter itself. It's a grotesque giant, is how it's often shown. Huge, huge, tall and gangly. And as with every single bloody creature I talk about in this series, it emits a foul stench of death and decay. To quote Basil Johnston, he has a book on the Manitous. The pain of others means nothing to the Wendigo. All that matters is its survival. It is a monstrous creature. These giant spirits were so large, their upper body could be entirely shrouded in dark clouds from above, and their arrival was often preceded by the howling of the winds and the bitterest of chills. If they caught somebody, if you were being chased by a Wendigo and you got caught, they would devour you ferociously, drinking your blood and consuming your flesh, and even that would not satiate the beast's insatiable hunger. The beast would instead grow even taller. You know, this is how the Wendigos grew and became so humongous. By the way, something that's oft, like, 100% left out of, like, mainstream media's interpretation of the Wendigo. They're always, like, man-sized. But in the original lore, in the original folktales, I should say, they just grew and grew and grew, and every time they consumed somebody, they would grow even bigger still, until they were, quite literally, in the clouds. Are you having a nap? You're having a nap. It's just eaten, and it wants to chill for a minute. The Wendigo's selfish, greedy hunt, though, was very much on purpose. It's, you know, there's a reason it exists. And that's because the Wendigo itself is a warning against selfishness and greed. A lesson to teach people that they've got to think of others and live selfishly, otherwise the spirits themselves, the Manitous, the Wendigo, I should say, would search them out. So not only is it this large, ferocious, monstrous, flesh-eating creature, but it's the embodiment of greed, and eventually, as we'll see, capitalism, colonialism, and stuff like that. So, I ask you, is not the Indominus Rex the absolute perfect dinosaur to represent the Wendigo, because the Indominus Rex in Jurassic World, I think the point was maybe not as sharp as it should have been in Jurassic World, I will say, but fair play to the film, the point of the Indominus Rex was a comment on corporate greed and excess and a desire for more and more and more, in the face of, instead of like just observing and appreciating nature's natural beauty, it was all about bringing in more money to the park, bigger, more teeth, basically. Bigger, scarier, more teeth, and there it is. So the Wendigo and the Indominus Rex are very tied in some ways in which are incredibly ironic, which we'll get to in a little bit. I don't break out that, right? Do you? You're really enjoying that fence, and it makes me nervous. I'm not gonna lie. If you want to back away from there, that'd be cool beans. I'm gonna bring some trees in. I think we need some redwoods again. I am tempted, very slightly, to actually get rid of all the tropical trees and just full on go redwoods. I just don't want a brush. What I really want is a redwood brush. If anyone can ever put that into the game, you will be a hero. I will have many terrifying babies with you, honestly. I think at the very least, if you're keeping all of them, it adds like a nice bit of sort of height difference. It looks a little bit samey when they're all this triple, but imagine doing this with the single. I would go mental. I have to look after my mental health here, okay? Okay. That's better, honestly. It already looks like it's got a bit more of a chill about it, just because of how the redwoods look. I like the idea of this being, like, they're kind of like sitting by the side of the road primarily. And we'll dot some of these in every now and again. Again, just offering different heights, different textures, different sizes. Make it look a bit more like an actual natural forest, I guess. And what about you? What do you look like? That looks a little bit too much like that one, so let's see what that one's like. You're a tall boy, I like that. I like my boys tall, apparently. Get a little bit of rotation on the go there. Lovely stuff, lovely stuff. So I'll talk very briefly about the plans for the Cryptid Park and cryptids in general. So people have been asking when I'm coming back with Planet Zoo. One of the reasons I'm hesitant right now is I'd really like to do a Planet Zoo cryptid series. We could do some really, really cool stuff in Planet Zoo just because we do have much more creative control. And I've got a bit of an idea about how to do it. I know people want Planet Zoo Sandbox to come back. So do I. Oh, you need some food. I'm sorry, buddy. I will admit I'm completely burned out on Temple Zoo. Actually, I have some deep problems with Temple Zoo, which people kind of brought up in the past, which I'll probably talk about at some point. But even the Artist Arand, which I love and really enjoyed, so much time is spent on the busy work between enclosures. I love building the animal enclosures, it really makes me happy. But there's a lot of time spent on the busy work between enclosures. 4 to 5 hours, 6, 7, 8 hours even, per enclosure has like another 8 hours on top of it just to connect it to the next enclosure. And I, A, don't have the time, and I, B, I don't have the drive to do that anymore. So what I'm thinking, I've got a little bit of a plan in my head about how to design a park that would have basically none of that busy work whatsoever. It would be slightly modular, and you'd walk around through like an underground tunnel, and, well, it would actually be an above ground tunnel, but covered in rocks. You'd walk through a tunnel, and there'd be a gap, and you'd see the enclosure, and you'd move on. And that's it, it's just a tunnel. And I could kind of put it together bit by bit. And that way, we could get back to, what I want to do in the game. But that's still a consideration. I'm thinking about that. So, we're gonna follow our Indom around for a little bit. Tell you what, let's go capture mode. As we observe him in slow motion. So, the tales of the Wendigo, as I've said, greed, all this kind of jazz. The tales would, however, change over time. The Wendigo itself had to evolve. Now, the reason for this was, indeed, Caucasian invasion. Did not mean for that to rhyme. And colonization, again, inverted commas. As people travelled over from Europe, slaughtering and claiming land for their own. And really, I hesitated to put this kind of stuff in this video because I think, even if it's only 1 in 1,000, there will be somebody hearing what I just said and they'll take offence at it. Somebody will hear that basically the white man came over to America and killed lots and lots of people and took the land for themselves. Because people struggle sometimes to admit that their people's history is bloody and brutal and terrible. I'll see why. As long as you're not that person and you don't want to participate in that kind of activity, it shouldn't matter to you, as far as I'm concerned. And I think denying what your people have done in the past is far more dangerous. Anyways, my opinion. Whatever. So, as people came over, the Algonquin tribe's definition of the Wendigo had to change. In the past, it was a spirit. Like I say, it was a Manitou. It came, and if you were greedy or whatever, it would eat you, essentially. And it would. That's what the fear was. If you're greedy, the Manitou will eat you. To sum it up very basically. It had to change, though, from not just being a spirit, but indeed being something that could possibly inhabit another human being. So basically, the reasoning for that is the invaders came over with excess greed and selfishness, taking this land for their own that wasn't theirs, and they, in essence, became Wendigos all of their own. So the Wendigo itself had to be not just this monstrous-looking spirit, but it could be something in another human being who still looked like a human being, which is, I think, where the human-beast transformation element of the Wendigo comes from, because there's this idea that a man could become a Wendigo. Anyways. Now, there were several ways you could become a Wendigo, must be said. You could be possessed by the spirit of a Wendigo. You could be cursed by a fellow human. There's a story of this man who was spurned by a woman. So he made like a snowman off her and cursed it and killed it or whatever. And she became a Wendigo and died, essentially. Or you could turn into one by devolving into greed and desperate hunger. Now, this is where the Wendigo links with... Can you stop moving? I'm trying to talk to YouTube. This is where the Wendigo links with cannibalism come from. As harsh winters and a lack of food ravished the indigenous populations, some would turn to feasting upon human flesh, or at least that's how the stories went, and thus be turned into Wendigos. Because, they're exhibiting greed, essentially. The only way to stop this was to live selfishly and prepare for those harsh winters, to be ready and, able to survive without having to live selfishly and indeed consuming another human being, which is a pretty selfish thing to do, to kill someone to eat them, in my opinion. So again, the point of the Wendigo was to teach good values, values that many of the Algonquins actually thought were being destroyed in the wake of rampant colonialization and submission by large swathes of the Algonquins, understandably, to their colonizers. It's no coincidence that the Wendigo is often said to have a heart made of pure ice. So, basically, the Wendigo was always linked in with greed and consumption. And then, inevitably, when people came over, developing these characteristics, it's said, by the way, that prior to their arrival, the Algonquins had no word for greed, because it wasn't a concept that existed to them, because living so selfishly just wouldn't have crossed their minds for a moment. It had to be introduced as a concept when the white man came over, basically. Yeah, it's interesting. And then there's the whole links with cannibalism. I don't really go into that at all later on in this, but essentially the perception of the Algonquins and other indigenous tribes by the people in Europe was of them as savages and of beasts of their own, essentially, and of prolific cannibals. So... Beautiful. Whilst there is a large, well, at least part of Algonquin history of the Wendigo, especially more modern history of the Wendigo, does have ties to cannibalism, and there are stories of Algonquin warriors defeating Wendigos that have become that way because they feasted upon other humans. A lot of the, at least from what I can tell, the modern interpretation of the Wendigo as this Native American folklore monster is essentially tied to these Western perceptions of the Algonquins as savage, animalistic cannibals themselves. So it's a little bit iffy. There's not really much else to do to the exhibit. We'll just keep watching. I'll just finish off. Only got one paragraph left to go. So that's the history of a very, very brief history of the Wendigo in Algonquin circles. What about in mainstream media? Well, if you think to any host of TV shows such as X-Files, Supernatural, DuckTales, genuinely DuckTales, the Wendigo has, generally speaking, maintained two primary traits: the cannibalism, the desire to consume human flesh, and the beastly appearance. It always looks monstrous. The spirituality, the real meaning behind the Wendigo, the greed, and the lessons it was there to teach people, all this kind of jazz, is essentially done with. I actually watched that X-Files episode really recently, as in like a few weeks ago, as a coincidence, and the Wendigo in that episode is basically a werewolf. It is just full-on a werewolf. They actually mention lycanthropy in the episode, so it's ridiculous anyways. Now, I do want to give a little shout-out, because most media interprets it in this whole new mainstream way, doesn't mean they all do, and I want to give a little shout-out to Until Dawn, okay? I remember, foolishly, I will say, this was my mistake. When I played Until Dawn, I was a little disappointed that the Wendigos didn't resemble the Wendigo as I had come to know it, as this gaunt deer, beast, wolf thing with the antlers and everything. That's how I perceived the Wendigo. And Until Dawn's version basically looked like dudes, like white dudes, like pale white skin, and they ate people. However, while they may not directly resemble the Algonquin version, they're not giants, they're not in the trees and all this kind of jazz, they are indeed caused by the eating of flesh, but not only by that, but the Wendigos in Until Dawn, and spoilers for this 10-year-old game by the way, are people who became Wendigos because they came to pillage the mountain. They came to mine the mountain for its resources, very selfishly and greedily. They got trapped there, they had to resort to eating human flesh. That's terrifying. Very cool though, perfect. And therefore they became Wendigos. So it does have several of the actual proper facets that the Algonquins would have included in their tales of the Wendigo. And I think whilst it's important to acknowledge that a lot of our versions of the Wendigo don't line up with the folklore originations of the tale, it's also worth crediting when people actually do, pay actual credit to the origins of the tale. So, well done, Until Dawn. Until Dawn, if you're watching this video, I'm proud of you. The more common interpretation, like I say, if you Google Wendigo, this is what you'll see. It's a gaunt, usually human-sized, maybe a little bit bigger, man-beast sort of hybrid, usually with antlers. And that seems to have originated in several short horror stories, particularly in the early 1900s. And then later on, actually in Stephen King's Pet Sematary, it was actually the first time I could see mention of it having antlers. And I actually think Pet Sematary may have been the first time. And then from that story, and that could be wrong, that is my interpretation. I couldn't find an earlier link, but if anyone does, feel free to hit me up. But in Pet Sematary, there's a Wendigo. It's like this embodiment of evil, and it's got antlers instead of eyes. They come out of the eye sockets. And that is the first time I can see it mentioned, and now it's absolutely bloody everywhere. So it's interesting how just one very, very mainstream and popular book could define interpretation of this folklore creature for generations to come. And its appearance in... So this is my closing little statement here. The Wendigo's appearance in this huge host of modern American products, and European products as well, Western modern mainstream products, it's really, really ironic. The Wendigo in Algonquin culture is, as we've said, it came to represent... Originally it was just, be a good person or you'll get eaten, right? Prepare for the winter, blah, 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 blah. But it very much came to represent, it evolved to represent the greed and the dangers of capitalism. And yet here we are, with all of these mainstream products designed to make money and nothing else, misrepresenting the Wendigo. The incredible irony of that blows my mind. It really does. It's crazy. And I'm no better. I did a playthrough of Until Dawn. I'm doing this video. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, but at the end of the day, it's a video on my channel, blah, 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 blah. I just think it's really interesting to think about how the creature is being used in something that it ceased to destroy in the first place. That it was this evil manifestation of the invaders who, in turn, used it to sell product. It's just bizarre to me. It's very... It doesn't really suit the point of the creature, to say the least. Anyways, that's the tale of the Wendigo. That's everything I wrote down. There were moments of awkwardness preparing this video as I evaluated my own interpretations and ignorance. I will fully admit that I was completely 100% ignorant to the actual spiritual original origins of the Wendigo. My perception of the Wendigo was the Wendigo that we are given in popular culture. From Pet Sematary, from various other things. To the point where I was disappointed by the Until Dawn one. As I said, I think it's important to acknowledge where you may have messed up in the past, and I don't know. On one hand, I'm like, well, should I, every single cool creature out there, should I slavishly, research it and find out what it's about? That might be a lot to put on people. But on the other hand, yeah, maybe. I love this series. It's opened my eyes to so much that I never knew before. I hesitate, I really do, to call the Wendigo a cryptid, because I think that, it's not a cryptid. Like, it's not a real creature, obviously not. And I don't think anyone, or people think it is an actual beastly, worldly creature. Then again, like I say, people have reported seeing it in the wild, so whatever. But I also think calling it a cryptid to an extent devalues its original meaning, and I'm really struggling in part in my head just to kind of coalesce calling it a cryptid, matching it with the Indominus, putting it in the park, and that with the very deep spiritual origins of the creature. That said, most cryptids do have spiritual folklore origins, they really do. Even the first dinosaur we ever did, Mokele-Mbembe, not quite to the levels of the Wendigo, it must be said, but the Mokele is a cryptid born in folklore and tales and mythologies, as most are. At least in the in Africas and the indigenous tribes and the further east you get and stuff like that. You find that the more modernised an area becomes, the more a cryptid tends to be a spooky creature in the woods, unless it becomes steeped in folklore and tradition and messaging and stuff like that, but I could talk about this for a very long time. I really recommend you go, if you've got a spare couple of hours, or whatever, a spare hour or so, definitely go check the paper out. It is fascinating stuff. It's really interesting. It solidified my desire to do a proper series on the cryptids, so I had a little bit of an idea. Someone in the past suggested I do like a journal diary entry, and that's how we'll talk about cryptids. What I think I want to do, so I love to write, and as many of you know, I was working on a book. The book is fairly dead, but we'll see how that goes. But I want to get back to writing. I don't feel like I've got enough time to write very often these days, and I'd like to write a lot more. So what I was thinking of doing is doing a short story on a cryptid, basically. Say 3,000 words or so. Maybe even a little bit shorter. And I would write a short story about these cryptids. The Wendigo, the Mokele, any cryptid on the planet. It could be any single one. And the short story would include various true facts about the origins of the creature, its discovery. Let's say it's the Beast of Bray Road instead. Maybe it takes place in the early 1900s, and that first night of its discovery, stuff like that. And I would find ways to include the actual facts. I'd always want them to be educational. Maybe we could even have an educational section at the end or something, I don't know. I haven't thought it through all the way. But basically, I would write the short story with as much of this research in it as possible, and then read it. Basically, we'll do a dramatic video, with the spooky music in the background and some fog rolling past the tree line and all this kind of jazz. And I'll basically read my short story on the video, and that way we can learn about the creature, but also enjoy it in kind of like a fictionalized kind of sense. I get to write a little bit more, and I think it'd be really interesting. So that's kind of the direction I'm leaning in. Maybe some of those would be like journal entries, some of them would just be full-on stories, first person, third person, just mix it up a little bit, make them all very different. Maybe some of them would even be long-form poetry, who knows. I think it'd be really fun to experiment and try lots of different cryptids in lots of different ways. All probably horror-focused, because that's kind of my jam, but other than that, yeah. And then, eventually down the line, let's say I do 20 of them, stick them in like a collection, a book kind of thing. I think that'd be really cool, so that's something I'm very much considering. I'd love to hear your opinions and thoughts down below. Although this would take me to an awkward state again with the Wendigo, wherein I would feel uncomfortable given everything I've just said today. I really need to think about that. I can't coalesce that in my own brain. It's a complex and touchy subject that I don't think can really be summed up in a YouTube video, or indeed in a YouTube comment section. And if people feel differently about the Wendigo, I do want to say this very quickly. If you feel differently about the stuff I've said today, that's totally within your right, and I wouldn't judge anyone for doing so. Your priorities and where your moral stance is on this, and it is a sort of grey area. A lot of it is quite black and white, but there's definitely some grey at play in certain aspects of what I said. If you lean one way or the other, I definitely wouldn't judge you. I'd hope you wouldn't judge me. We might just have different views on the subject. I think it's a really interesting thing to talk about and debate, so I'm really curious as to what your comments are. Hopefully I didn't annoy anyone too much, but we'll see what happens. Either way, thank you so much for joining me. Feel free to name our Wendigo in the comment section in the cutie, linked in the description of the video, down below, our INDOMINUS Wendigo, as it's going to be called, before it gets bigger. Thank you so much for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. If you did enjoy this video, if you appreciate the research and work I put into these videos, then I would very much appreciate a like and indeed a comment. I really want to see your comments on this one. It's a fascinating subject with a lot to discuss. So let me know what you think down below. Let me know what you think down below in the comment section. And I'll see you lovely folks next time. Cheers much love as always. Bye-bye.